Ralph Sanji, WGSO.
In 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi.
Welcome to the Battle of New Orleans Radio with your host Nathan Lawrence and my co-host
Goyam
on WGSO 990 AM and at WGSO.com. They're fighting for freedom and
opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy.
Battle of New Orleans Radio with your hosts Nathan Lawrence, Caleb Hitt, and Goyam on 990 WGSO.
All right, Battle of New Orleans Radio. We are here. This is Goyam, along with trusty co-host Nathan Lawrenson.
Yeah, what's going on, Goyam? How you doing tonight, man? It's glad to have us both in studio. It's probably the first time in 4 or 5 weeks. We've both been in studio.
Been really busy lately, personally.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, we have a hardcore show tonight. Starting on the second segment, we have historian Mr. Mark Weber. It's going to be very, very exciting. He's going to be on Skype, and we're going to discuss really everything, really the past 100 years, how we've lost control and who has really been behind, this loss of control and the whole lie and narrative that's really taken us over, through the lie. And we're going to discuss a lot more than that. We're going to have him on for an hour and 45 minutes. So
he's been on Montel Williams' show. He's been on a lot of big programs, actually.
Absolutely. He's debated a lot of big people. So it's going to be very, very exciting. So,
and look, we'll say one thing locally, and then we'll get to our national guest later. But, obviously everybody's talking about right now the situation in New Orleans where there was a flood, basically a decent-sized rain situation there Saturday in New Orleans. On top of everything else, we've been called the tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists to say that Walt Isaacson and Mitch Landrieu and their Aspen Institute is actually intending to clear out the city, push this Agenda 21 matrix where they gentrify predominantly black neighborhoods. They're clearing out middle-class white neighborhoods, if there's not that many left of those in Orleans Parish, but, basically frustrating them with the monuments, with the out-of-control crime, now with these flood situations. This past weekend, they had a situation in New Orleans where they had about 8 inches of rain there, Nathan, within a few hours span. And, the rumors, still we do not have clarification on this.
How many inches you said?
They said 8.
Okay, well, check this out. They can calculate how much rain to the 100th, to the 10th. Mm-hmm. Well, I heard the little Soros-eyes governor, John Bell Edwards, he did receive money from George Soros there. He said between 5 to 8 inches. So is it 5 inches? Is it 8 inches?
Lots of questions. Were the pumps broken? Basically, long story short, areas that really never see flooding or this rapid of a flood, even they had flooding in the French Quarter, which some people says never flooded in 200 years. It's so high up there in the river, near the river banks. It's just a shocking development this weekend. A lot of people got flooded. Houses got flooded from this basically a normal rain event. Whether that was HAARP-induced or not, the situation was now they're saying the Sewage and Water Board, the pumps weren't working. Some people were saying they have video footage of water going into the streets, that the pumps that were working were pumping water into the streets. We've heard that Mitch Landrieu was at the Aspen Institute meeting in Aspen, Colorado.
No.
He was.
No, officially he was. He was there. We keep hearing the Aspen Institute, and we're going to take credit on this show, because I don't think we take credit for pushing the narrative of this. Goyam and I have really pushed the whole narrative forward here in the city of New Orleans, who's really been behind the scenes pulling the strings, who's been the puppet master, and it's been Walter Isaacson, it's been the Aspen Institute, and
Goldman Sachs with the red light cameras.
Yeah, but it's all tied into the same giant conspiracy.
We lost our city. That's the problem. That's the thing. Well, it's other entities are in charge now.
And that happened officially in 2005 once Katrina happened, and then they inserted Walter Isaacson over the head of the Louisiana Recovery Authority along with the Rockefeller Foundation. So we've seen this happen in 2005, and that's how they inserted the Sustainable Development, the Agenda 21, through all the grant money that we received. And that's how we've lost our freedom and our sovereignty here in New Orleans. And we see this continue. Now they ramp the crime up or make it appear like it's out of control, when if you go back to the 1990s, the crime, it was a war zone here. The crime is still bad, but it was nowhere near like it was in the 1990s.
The local media is all over that, Nathan, and that same media did not investigate the monument situation. They're not investigating right now this situation with the sewage and water board. Yesterday, I think the head mayor...
Pumps were locked.
They didn't start. Some people said they didn't start till 5 hours after the rain situation. There was a report that there was water being pumped into the streets, which, again, leads to the conspiracy theories that they're trying to scare everyone out of the city. Because, again, rain, floods, crime, red light cameras, monuments, you name it. This obviously frustrates your average New Orleanian who's, wants to protect themselves and wants to protect their heritage here. Again, this guy, one of the leaders, he retired yesterday with a full pension. Not much of a slap on the wrist there, but they basically the local narrative, the local media narrative is that this was all climate change. That climate change clogged the drains up. That climate change is why the pumps did not work. Is climate change is the reason why we had so many issues Saturday on it's hurricane season here. They need to be prepared.
Absolutely, totally. And see, you have to look at the narrative that's being pushed immediately after one of these key events happen to understand what's going on. Because you see immediately when the event happened, after it happened, climate change, money. So what's going to be the end game goal here? This is going to be multifaceted, tenfold, just like the
just like with crime here. Look, they could go, well, we got to put up more crime cameras. Or I see people on Facebook going, well, let's bring the National Guard in. Let's bring the police state in.
State troopers.
Let's bring or like you said with the flooding. Well, let's get the grant money. We have a catastrophic event. Let's do that. Didn't happen exactly like they wanted maybe Saturday, but to me, this was intentional. Clearly, I saw video footage of water going into the streets.
People should be pissed off because check this out. In Lakeview, after it flooded at 11 p.m., they went to the pump stations and then turned the pumps on and immediately subsided. So there is clear malfeasance here. Yeah. Clearly. I mean, this is totally ridiculous because...
He got his full retirement, the leader of the Sewage and Water Board. And now they're saying Ryan Burney, who was in the Antifa vehicle at the surge or the siege at a Jefferson Davis monument, might be joining the Sewage and Water Board.
Isn't Ryan Burney part of the whole United Nations, Rockefeller Foundation, Resiliency City program and plan? He is part of this. And we see, look, man, everybody's wondering, the New World Order isn't coming. It's here. It's here in these cities. And it's everywhere now. They've taken us over with the Sustainable Development Agenda 21 plan.
Yeah, but football starts tomorrow. So
and nobody's going to give a damn.
Once Saints play tomorrow in New Orleans, everyone's going to forget all about it. Preseason started. And the average lemming is begging for football to distract them from reality. Oh, please. The fantasy football's got to start. I saw a countdown. Some people were fighting over it. They're like, hey, we're 80 days away. No, we're 81 days away from football, dude. Well, we're 62 because of training camp.
Yeah,
we're going off on a tangent, but it's sad. We're going to lose. Everyone's going to forget all about this once football kicks in.
Absolutely. But you know what, Goyim? People feel this flood, there's something off. Everybody I talk to.
The liberal conservative, white, black, something ain't right. That's true. It's very bipartisan.
Especially, because I live uptown, and it's a mixed bag where I live. There's black, there's white. I mean, there's Jew, there's Gentile.
Just like Jew, Gentile area.
I mean, it's
same like my neighborhood.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying. So
it's like a Coca-Cola commercial.
That's right. But the black people in the neighborhood you talk to, they've been screwed over a lot in their lives. They've been socially engineered 6 ways to Sunday.
Tuskegee.
Yeah, that's right. They all feel like, as soon as I instantly say, I think this is deliberate, and they say, well, absolutely it's deliberate. They buy into it, for sure. Yeah. But then you speak to the middle class.
The one who's waiting for football.
Yeah, you speak to the middle class white guy, and they have a lot harder time.
Are you telling me they're trying to flood us out? They're trying to scare us out?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so they can scoop up what you leave behind. Jack, you know what?
And then it's tied into, and then Mr. Carrera brought this up today or yesterday about, the North Shore. The North Shore, there's been more crime happening because with these new developments they build on the North Shore, it's all tied in with Agenda 2030, Agenda 21, Sustainable Development, is that these new developments, they have to build mixed family housing in near the development to get the grant money and the developers in order to do that, to get the permits and the whole 9 yards, to get the money from HUD. So they do this. So a lot of the people, because of the crime, even the African Americans, are leaving the city, going to the North Shore. So they're clearing everybody. They're clearing the locals out. So then they could bring in the gentrification gangsters. I just termed that the gentrification gangsters from the Northeast, the California
hipsters, the Antifa, the future Antifa of America.
Absolutely. As our population is dwindling, Louisiana, you can't afford the insurance. What do you think is going to happen to your insurance rates, ladies and gentlemen? What do you think is going to happen to your taxes? It's going to be sky high after this. We already are paying the most taxes, the highest insurance rates, and it's just going to be tenfold, man. Mitch Landrieu sat on his hands.
And LaToya Cantrell is going to be the same thing. Walt Isaacson puppet.
And she's dumb as a box of rocks. I know she was supposed to come on the show. She ain't coming. She's not coming on the show. She was never coming on this show.
We plan to expose Walt Isaacson at all costs. Look, we're getting off the local issues. We're going to national issues next.
We'll come back. Mr. Mark Weber from the Institute for Historical Review. Battle of New Orleans Radio. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. Battle of New Orleans Radio, right here, 990 AM, WGSO in the heart of the Crescent City. And we are the home of the First Amendment. You will not receive any of this information or point of view from any other radio station in this area or probably in the Gulf South.
And we've been questioned for our content, but look, we allow everyone to speak. We've had a controversial guest on before in the eyes of some of our listener audience, but again, we care about our First Amendment rights and preserving that. Again, it's been very frustrating on a local level this whole year. 2017 has been just a quagmire for our city, and we do really believe that things start locally before you can move to a national level. But like Nathan was saying, this United Nations Agenda 21 package, what we keep hearing about, is coming on a local level. Right, Nathan? The United Nations Agenda 21 package is coming on a local level. It's infiltrating the local level.
It's not coming. It's here.
It's here.
Like a freight train. So it's like a freight train, and they've got us, and they've been hammering this point since 1992. But look, we have a great guest, man, and this guest may be controversial to some people, just from the points of view that he may have, but many of our listeners have the same point of view, and I share many of his points as well, and so it's going to be a great show. And this is Mr. Mark Weber. We're trying to work out some technical difficulties right now. We're about to have him on here in just a second. So, all right, Mr. Mark Weber is an American historian. He's an author, lecturer, a current affair analyst. He is also the director of the Institute for Historical Review, an independent public interest educational system in Southern California that works to promote peace, understanding, and justice through greater public awareness of the past. In particular, the IHR strives to increase understanding of the causes, nature, and consequences of war and conflict. His many articles, reviews, essays dealing with historical, political, and social issues have appeared in a variety of periodicals and in a range of languages. Over the years, he has given many lectures and interviews on foreign policy, social political trends in the U.S., and international relations. He has produced dozens of broadcast talks. Weber has been a guest on numerous radio talk shows and has appeared many times on television, including on the nationally broadcast Hannity and Combs, Montel Williams Show. And he also has conducted countless interviews with television, radio, print, journalists from across the United States, from other overseas countries.
And Nathan, looks like we got him on the air now. Mr. Mark Weber, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello.
Hey, how's it going, man?
Man, we really appreciate you coming on the air tonight with us, Mr. Weber. I just went over a little bit of your bio, and we just really want to...
We respect anybody who, the controversiality of your content in the eyes of some people, not in our eyes. I respect it because I know you've caught a lot of fire for that. We have, too. We understand. We go to work. We've dealt with consequences for, having a show like this, and people question it, and we allow people to speak. And it's almost as if people don't want allow every aspect of the different varieties of people we see on Earth to speak on our show. We've had entities like Black Panthers on our show. We've had, David Dukes come on our show before. We've had who else? We've had all kinds of characters.
Yeah, but we're not throwing Mr. Weber in any of these light. He's a historian, and he's going to give us historical perspective and evidence. So I don't want to muddy the waters, Goyam, and even throw, So, look, I really want to give the floor to you, Mr. Weber, and I would like to start with, the past 100 years, and maybe we could begin with, the Soviet Revolution that took place in the earliest 20th century, and then, fast forward from there, and then continue to, World War II, the Holocaust, fast forward to, Ronald Reagan today with President Trump. So, really, Mr. Weber, I would really just love to give the floor to you and give this time for you so you can speak your mind. So thank you, Mr. Weber. The floor is all yours.
Well, okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be on the show, and there's really two reasons why I'm glad to be on the show. First of all, because New Orleans has been in the news a lot about history recently. Mm-hmm. The big argument about tearing down the Confederate statues in New Orleans has gotten international attention, and that really highlights the importance of how we look at history, because it says much more about society than just whether this monument or this statue is up or down. But anyway, New Orleans has been in the news. But there's another reason, too. I have a family tie to Louisiana that I very rarely ever talk about. I don't usually talk about my own personal life, but my mother's father was from Louisiana.
Oh,
and
wow.
One member of our family used to. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and one of my great aunts used to make a trip every year to Thibodaux, Louisiana.
Uh-oh.
Because there was a big family reunion of her whole side of the family that came from Kramer, Louisiana. But they had a family reunion every year for years in Thibodaux, and she would go down to make sure to see that, and that was a high point of her year. Now, I never went, but it's my only tie to Louisiana in that way. But I've always
bucket list.
Felt very
We're going to go, Mark. We'll take you down there.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Man.
It's an odd side of the family. It's a side of the family that actually is from Alsace in this French-German area, and that's why Kramer is not a very typical either French or Spanish or English name. It's actually a German or French-German name. And nearby is this town of Des Allemands, I guess, which means German or something. Anyway, that's a side of my family on my mother's father's side.
Well, you might have a little Kunas in you there, Mr. Weber.
Term for Cajun people.
Hey, well, Mr. Weber, look, this segment's real short. We're coming to a break. Look, we're going to come right back to you and open the floor. It's all yours, brother. Look, ladies and gentlemen, This is Mr. Mark Weber. Go check out the great website, Institute for Historical Review, and go check out many of his broadcasts. They're unbelievable and very educational. Battle of New Orleans Radio will be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. You're listening to Battle of New Orleans Radio right here on 990 AM WGSO, right here in the heart of the Crescent City, home of the First Amendment. And, man, I'm very excited to have our guest on, Mr. Mark Weber. You can check his work out at the Institute for Historical Review. He's a historian. He has a doctorate degree.
If you want to call in, 504-556-9696.
But you know what, Glenn? I want to hold all calls until the end of the show. That way, Mr. Weber can really
get a chance to tell us.
really hammer the points, and maybe towards the end of the show. So please hold all calls to the end of the broadcast. Mr. Weber, I just want to turn the floor over to you. And then, you can really get started breaking all this information down. That way we can try to, wake some of our listeners up. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Do you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. I'm going to turn off the phone then. Okay. Well, I want to start by making kind of a general point. And we're sometimes accused of rewriting history. People will say, oh, Mr. Weber, what you're saying is no good because you're rewriting history. Well, we live in an era in which there's a heck of a lot of rewriting of history going on in our society and around the world, and nowhere is that more true than in New Orleans.
True. Men
who were revered and honored in American history for 100 or 200 years are now considered bad guys. And if there's any sort of rewriting of history going on, it's going on by people who have power and influence in our society. It used to be when I was young, people took the day off for Columbus Day. Christopher Columbus was considered a great guy. Now he's considered a bad guy because, after all, he brought all that oppression and slavery and bad things to North America. And in many parts of the United States, it's now Columbus Day is now called Indigenous Peoples Day. Well, that's a real rewriting of history. And the reason I'm mentioning this is to make the big point, which is, I think, one of the big points I'm going to try to go back to over and over. And that is that how we look at the past, how we look at history in every society is set by those who have power in that society. It reflects always the interests, the agenda, and the outlook of those who have power. And the change in history isn't just because somebody had an idea that we should look at things differently or so forth. It's because those people who the change in history reflects a change in who has power in society, and that's a point that needs to be kept over and over again. So that whether we're looking at the American Revolution, where we're looking at Columbus, where we're looking at the Civil War, whether we're looking at the history of the United States in the last 20 or 40 or 50 years, that is going to be reflected in our motion pictures, in our television, our movies, and our textbooks in schools, according to those who have power. And we're going in America today through a kind of cultural revolution. It represents a huge shift in this has been going on for some time, but a big shift in the interests and the agenda of those who have power in our society. Now, the other thing I want to make, the other big point I want to make in this regard is that the more we understand about history, the more we understand about the past, and we can put ourselves in the past, the more we reject this idea that there are good guys and bad guys in history. And the more we understand that history is much more about a clash of group identities and group interests. That's really what's really going on when we talk about good guys and bad guys. And right now in America, the South and the Confederacy is considered bad guys, so we got to tear down the statues of bad guys. But that's not what's really happening. What's really happening is a shift in the ascendancy, the rise over the last 40, 50 years of different groups and different interests in the United States and in especially in the South, and the big change that's taken place in the South. Anyway, that's a kind of a preliminary point I want to make, so that when we look at whether it's the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution takeover, the First World War, the Second World War, it's always important to keep in mind that the prevailing view in our society, the so-called correct view, is going to be reflecting the interest and the agenda and the outlook of those who have power. That's kind of my sort of opening point, that these points need to be kept always in mind, I think.
No, absolutely, and I agree with that. We tend to look at history like you're saying, with these glasses, either you're good or you're evil. But everything that's taken place in history, just like everything else, there's these gray areas, and we're taught in school it's only black or white, and that's it, and we never look at the other perspective of the stuff really behind the scenes that really went on and really took place. So I think that's a great point, Mr. Weber.
Right. Well, because people, the more simple we are, the more we want a very simple narrative. Who's the good guys? Who's the bad guys? Like a comic book or like a very simple movie. But the more we understand about the past, we realize, well, people have different points of views. And that's one of the main goals, I think, always is try to understand the other person's point of view. It's not that they're evil or bad so often, is they have a different perspective based on their identity, based on their perception of themselves. And that's what's really, I think that's the great problem in every big society. When every big society has major clashes and problems, those problems are almost always questions of identity. Who am I? What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be a Southerner? That changes because it's rooted in our sense of who we are. That's true of nations, of societies. It's true of individuals. When an individual faces a crisis and a person has to sit down and decide something, he first of all has to answer one way or the other the question, who am I really? What really matters to me? What's really important? And that's based on a question of identity. And America's identity is we're having these clashes in political life and cultural life and so forth because it's a real clash about, well, what does it mean even to be an American? What does that mean really? And people are asking very hard questions, and that confusion about identity in our society is still not resolved. And none of our political leaders, I think, are very good or clear about just laying out what does it mean to be American? What kind of country do we really want is based on an idea of who we are. What does we mean? And that's just a larger point that I think is really essential.
Our leaders are very contradictory because they claim they want, they paint this portrait of America, apple pie, freedom, the flag, but yet they do and promote, other things and other agendas. And, they promote internationalism and globalism, and they don't really, support Americanism or nationalism, America first. They never do. They're always working for the multinational corporations. And even, going to the whole Bolshevik Revolution, and, we're told this story in school. I know they don't even talk about this in school anymore, but we're told this story in school that, these were the Soviets, and that were really the whole Bolshevik Revolution, was started, a lot, mainly because of the Warburgs and, their train full of money and Lenin and the whole 9 yards. There really wasn't the Russian people or Russia. So, I'd really like, if you could speak on that, Mr. Weber. What's your take on that?
Well, yes, you're raising. You want to go back right into you mentioned this earlier about why is it that the Russian state, which had the Tsarist Russia, which had been in power for centuries, it was the ruling family was the Romanov dynasty in Russia, had been in power for more than 2 centuries. It seemed very strong, very secure. It came tumbling down during the First World War, and it came tumbling down because there were very, very deep inner divisions within that society by nationality. And first of all, during the First World War, Russia was bashed and hammered by the First World War, and people lost faith in their leaders. And in February of 1917, liberals or Westerners, first of all, overthrew the Tsarist regime. And then in November, or it's called the October Revolution, it depends on the calendar, the Bolsheviks took power. Well, who are these people? who were the Bolsheviks? How did they take power? They took power because they were dedicated Marxists. They were dedicated internationalists. They didn't care about Russia. They saw Russia as a jumping off point, as a foundation for a world union of Soviet socialist republics. They wanted, based on the Marxist idea, they wanted an international, they wanted the working class all over the world to rise up, overthrow their oppressors, and they would be the leaders of this. Now, I know it's considered controversial, but it's a fact that in the leadership of the Bolshevik movement in Russia that took power with Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and so forth in 1917, Jews played a very, very large role in this.
Absolutely.
And they were playing a large role because this is a reflection of the ideology itself. It was the ideology of Karl Marx, who himself came from a long line of rabbis, and he himself had a very international outlook. He wasn't loyal to any one country. In fact, the Communist Manifesto, you might say the most important document of the international Marxism and of the communist movement, proclaims very proudly that the workers of the world have no homeland or no fatherland. They have only their loyalty to each other as workers. It's an emphatically globalist manifesto. And this globalism has been accepted by many people in the United States who for many years have been stressing that America's identity is similar to that of the Marxists, in that America is really a country for everybody. We're for everybody. And many Americans accept this. It's very hard. In fact, many Americans accept simultaneously the view that we should have an America First policy, we should have an identity of our own, but at the same time, millions of Americans accept the line put out by our leaders that America is a different kind of country because it's a universalist country. It's a country for everybody. Well, if it's a country for everybody, it's really a country for nobody. That
Absolutely.
is, if it has a universal identity, it has no real identity. There's no such thing as a person who's everywhere or all things. People are defined. We are social beings. We're defined by our language, by our family, by our ancestry, by our religion, by the things that make us social beings. And to me, the whole notion, historically, of a universal society or a society that's everything is utopian. It's absurd, really. But that's this notion that our leaders have been pushing for many, many years, and many Americans accept it because of the unique nature of America's own history, makes us more accepting of this view than many other countries, which have a much more rooted and long, stable identity as a people, as a culture, as an ethnicity or race or religion or so forth. And that's one of the reasons why that America has this thing. But going back to the Bolshevik Revolution, the people who took power in 1917, first of all, the two main leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution were Vladimir Lenin, or Ulyanov, Lenin, and Trotsky. They took power in what is now St. Petersburg. It was Petrograd, and then in Moscow, and fought a very vicious, brutal civil war for several years before they were able to finally secure their power. But they did so. They proclaimed this takeover not in the name of the Russian people, not even for the benefit of the Russian people, but the name of what they called proletarian internationalism. It was to be the first stage of a universal, worldwide rising of the so-called oppressed peoples against their exploiters in line with this Marxist view. And this is very important. Ideology matters.
Hey, Mr. Weber, hold that thought. We're coming to a break here. We'll be right back. Look, ladies and gentlemen, listen to Battle of New Orleans Radio. We have a great guest, Mr. Mark Weber. Check out his work at the Institute for Historical Review. Look, most of the things that are happening to us have a Jewish undertone to it, unfortunately. And I know this is uncomfortable for some people to admit, You look at the Kalargi plan that, in my opinion, that's happening now. They're trying to drive Europeans out of Europe. They're trying to drive Americans out of Europe. We no longer breed anymore. We no longer have children.
Well, why would that benefit, though?
Yeah, I hear you. And then they open the doors, and we're being flooded by refugees. So, look, we need to. That's right. We need to expose really what's going on. Battle of New Orleans Radio will be right back.
We have finally figured it out. At first, we thought it was the Eskimos. But now there's a strong consensus amongst experts. It's an entirely different animal. If I had to name a creature to name, then make.
All right, we're back. Battle of New Orleans Radio with our guest, Mark Weber. You know, we were talking during the break. It's weird, you know, like if you certain people, if certain questions you get persecuted for asking. And I guess that kind of cues into what Mr. Weber talks a lot about. Mr. Weber, do you ever notice that a lot of people get persecuted for asking certain questions?
Of course, yes. I mean, Voltaire once said you can tell who has real power in society by seeing what people are not allowed to say, what they're not allowed to question.
Absolutely.
Yep.
That will tell you very quickly what the real hierarchy of values and of views and opinions and of power are in any society.
Well, Mr. Weber, really quickly, there's a guy locally in New Orleans. He's the former head of CNN. He's a member of the Trilateral Commission,
Council on Foreign Relations,
head of
Bilderberg
the Aspen
member.
Institute. You name it. We come to find out he's got fingerprints all over the monument removal. He's got fingerprints all over this Agenda 21 in New Orleans.
And he does have, and he is Jewish. And I bring this up because we see that, his name's Walter Isaacson, by the way, and we see, you know, behind all these things, we have, you know, these international Jews that are really pulling the strings and really doing a lot of this. So, I don't know. The floor is yours, Mr. Weber. Take that wherever you want.
Where I'll take it is this, and this is a thing that's millions of Americans see this, but they're not allowed, or they're afraid.
They're scared
to acknowledge a huge contradiction in our society, and the contradiction is this: organizations like the Anti-Defamation League or the major politicians in our society tell us over and over again that the United States must be a diverse society, that diversity is our strength. In a major speech, Bill Clinton, President Clinton said, diversity is our greatest strength, he claimed, that the more multicultural society is, the more diverse a society is, the better it is. We're told this over and over by political leaders, by our media, and this message is pressed onto the public consciousness in motion pictures and movies and television and so forth. At the same time, however, our political leaders tell us over and over that we must defend and support one country that is emphatically against diversity and multiculturalism. And that country is Israel. Yeah. The ADL, the Jewish, this major Jewish organization, and big organizations like that, which have the support of the media, have the support of our politicians, these organizations insist, they don't really say it's a desirable thing, but they insist that Israel must remain a specifically Jewish ethno-religious state. While at the same time, these same organizations and these same politicians tell us that the United States, Canada, and France, and Germany, and Britain, and Italy, and all those countries must be multicultural, multi-ethnic, as diverse states as possible. Now, why is this? What's the thinking behind this? The thinking is that these organizations, which are very openly, emphatically Jewish Zionist organizations, believe that when a society, any society, has a firm or explicit identity, culturally, racially, ethnically, religiously, whatever it is, they're not going to permit any other group to have decisive or important power in their society, including Jews.
Yeah, but wait, Mr. Weber, it's because they went through the Holocaust, right? That's at least the narrative I've always heard, is because they've gone through the Holocaust so they can preserve themselves that way. Go ahead.
Right. Well, of course, that's not true. The important emphasis on Jewish solidarity and identity goes back for many, many centuries. The Holocaust is only a more recent expression of this emphasis on a very, very emphatic, strong Jewish collective identity, agenda, purpose, outlook, and so forth. In fact, if you're old enough to remember, you may remember that during the 1950s or 1960s, we did not have Holocaust museums and Holocaust memorials and Holocaust days of remembrance across the United States. This began as a major campaign during the late 1970s. Up until that time, there were no encyclopedia entries for Holocaust. But this emphasis on the Holocaust and the fate of Jews in Europe during the Second World War is an expression of a very concerted campaign during the late 1970s carried out by the Anti-Defamation League, by NBC television, by politicians, by Jewish organizations, has succeeded in making this a very obligatory part of our cultural life and of our educational life. It's obligatory to emphasize this in schools, to the point where the suffering and the death and whatever oppression of Jews in the Second World War is given a hugely overproportional emphasis in contrast to the sufferings of non-Jews. And the lesson we're supposed to learn from this is that the more a group or a people has been oppressed, the more we should have sympathy for that group. The more that whatever that group does ought to be understood and excused or sympathized with, and that we should not have sympathy, so we're told, for the so-called oppressor. Well, this is especially helpful for Zionist groups in Israel and Jewish organizations because the state of Israel, in fact, routinely and for decades has been oppressing non-Jews in their own country, namely Christians and Muslims of Arab background in the West Bank and occupied territories of Israel. But we're supposed to forget about that because, after all, Jews suffered so much, so we have to be understanding, we have to be sympathetic, and so forth. But this is very hypocritical. This is extremely one-sided. And the expression of that is the way in which our politicians and our mass media stress the importance of Israel's identity as a specific Jewish ethnic religious state in contrast to every other country, which are supposed to be multicultural, diverse, and just individualistic and universal.
Well, Mr. Weber, I always hear everyone say either one, that Israel's our greatest ally, and I typically ask them why. It seems like we're giving them foreign aid. We don't get anything back. It seems like we're fighting their wars for them.
Pay 35% of their budget.
Yeah, and I ask that question, they just go, well, we are. We just are their greatest ally. Just deal with it, Or say they go to these, Bible-thumping churches, and the Christian Zionists are like, it says somewhere in the Bible, I'm not sure exactly where, but it says that they're the chosen people and we need to support them. But then I ask, like, with our tax dollars, with these wars against their enemies, with our soldiers on the line, and a lot of them just cannot respond. And I'm really curious to know what the answers to these questions are.
Well, look, Mr. Weber, before you answer that, we're coming to a break. Look, ladies and gentlemen, you listen to Battle of New Orleans Radio. Check out Mr. Mark Weber's work at the Institute for Historical Review. When we get back, I'd like to dive into, the Holocaust and the real facts of really what took place, because everything we know that we're taught is a lie. And until you admit that to yourself, that everything we've been told is a lie, you cannot move forward with the facts and the information because you are tied into it emotionally. And once you're tied into it emotionally, you will not look at the facts. So, Battle of New Orleans Radio, Mr. Mark Weber, will be right back.
All right, we're back, Battle of New Orleans Radio, with our guest, Mark Weber. Again, we usually talk a lot between breaks. Myself and Nathan were discussing, and Mark, you can chime in on this if you want. 60 million people died in World War II. That's the history where we were taught. And then, of course, the history we were taught as far as the Holocaust and Jews was that 6 million died. So my question to you is, and to the listening audience, myself and Nathan were talking about this, why is it that 6 million of those 60 million who died in World War II are, select or more important than the other, 54 million, and I guess that's something that ties into what you were saying before the break,
Right. Yeah, well, one of the most striking aspects about the Second World War is that if you ask and educate an ordinary American how many Jews were killed or died during the Second World War, almost automatically, reflexively, people say, well, 6 million.
6 million.
They've heard this over and over and over again.
6 million.
This figure is drummed into people's heads in our media and schools and so forth. But if you ask how many French or how many Russians or how many Poles or how many Japanese or even how many Americans died in the Second World War, even educated Americans have only the foggiest idea or no idea at all. Now, why is that? Why is there so much emphasis on the deaths or suffering or so forth of one particular people? Well, again, it goes back to the point I tried to make at the very beginning of the show. How we view the past, how we view history reflects the agenda, the interests, and the outlook of those who have power in our society or in any society. And the emphasis on the fate of Jews in the Second World War is not because 6 million Jews were or weren't killed. It's a reflection of the interest and the agenda of the organized Jewish community has in our society that puts a tremendous stress on that. In effect, we live in a society that has what I call a Judeo-centric view of history. What happens to Jews is considered far more important in our news coverage and so forth than what happens to other people. That's just a fact. Israel is considered very, very important in the American media. If an Israeli dies, if he's killed, that's a very, very big thing in our media. And we're supposed to all pay attention to it. Our politicians get very excited about it. And that's because, contrary to what was said earlier, it's not that everything we hear is false. It's more what one chooses to emphasize. I was mentioning earlier about the people who died during the Second World War. Very few people know that, according to all sorts of historians, something like 20 million Chinese died during the Second World War. Well, hardly anybody in America ever hears about that. Now, in China, of course, they hear a lot about it. I've been to China. They put much, of course, tremendous emphasis on how horrific the Second World War was in China. But Americans are almost oblivious to it. Instead, we hear over and over what happened to Jews. And we have in Washington, D.C., an official, huge Holocaust Memorial Museum that's a taxpayer-funded museum organized by a U.S. federal agency. We don't have any similar museum to any other group, not even Americans, really, not even a Second World War museum for the United States in Washington, D.C. And so it's not so much what happened in history, it's what we select from history and what lessons we claim or try to draw from history that's really decisive. It's not disputing so much what happened, but what the emphasis is and what the meaning of events in history are.
Yeah, and you're talking about history, Mr. Weber. You know, it seems like this historical event, the Holocaust, World War II, but the Holocaust in particular of that World War II subsect is like, off limits for research, and typically any other historical event that we know about is up for research and debate, just like anything's up for research and debate. And yet this is not. And it seems like you hear stories of people being persecuted or put in jail for researching this or denying things. This denying the official narrative is what I'm getting at.
Yes. This is a very important point, and it's one that I tried to make at the beginning. If you want to know who has power, see what is forbidden. Well, effectively in America, but even in other countries by law, so-called Holocaust denial is a crime. People who you're free to say whatever you want about the responsibility of the First World War, the Second World War, what you think about communism, or what you think about the assassination of Kennedy in 1963 or 9/11. You can say, 9/11's an inside job. You can say all sorts of things, and that's more or less permitted in the Western world or in the United States. But so-called Holocaust denial is effectively forbidden in the United States, but even more emphatically, more by law, it's forbidden in other countries because it's a crime. Well, why is it that this one chapter of history is treated in this way? Again, it's not because of what happened. It's a reflection of the power and interests in our society. And it's an indirect way of saying that Jewish interests or Jewish Zionist power and Jewish Zionists interests have a priority in our society and how we look at the past and how we look at the present.
Yes, sir. And Mr. Weber, what about for the people that say, well, look, man, they were sent to the gas chambers. It was terrible. Look, what about all the bodies? What about all the photographs of the dead, the dead Jewish people in the camps? Can you really get into that aspect of the, Auschwitz and these camps and the people suffering? And can you really break that down for us? Really, what really took place?
I'd rather not get into a big sort of specifics about it. That's not that. I mean, we can talk about that, but I think that takes us off the main point.
Okay, sure.
The main point. There's no disputing, I think, that many Jews were killed, died, and so forth in the Second World War.
Absolutely.
That's not the point. The big point is what we emphasize, what we highlight in our society, and what we're supposed to take from it. Look, during the Second World War, hundreds of thousands of Europeans were killed and in horrific bombings by the United States and Britain to kill as many civilians as possible. And of course, today is the anniversary of the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima, in which tens of thousands of Japanese civilians were killed. And a few days earlier is the anniversary on October 6th of the atomic bombing of, today is Nagasaki, before was Hiroshima. Those were massive killings of civilians. There was no essential reason why that had to be done. I don't want to get into the argument about that either, a discussion about it. But the point is, there's lots of pictures of suffering dead people. And, of course, the killing and the suffering of people has gone on and on and on in the years since then, including in Iraq after the U.S. invasion and bombing in 2003. Yep. Goes on all the time. But why is it that our schools make it an obligatory thing that we have to think about and remember the suffering of this one group of people? Again, I want to stress it's a reflection of who has power, of the agenda and the interest and the outlook of those who have power in our society.
Mr. Weber, and this reminds me of my youth watching or going into class, and you hear about Japan and Pearl Harbor, and you just hear about the attack. So are you saying basically, you never really heard what the motives were behind the Axis powers? We always heard about Germany's motives. Well, they had a crazy leader, and this guy wanted to genocide everybody. But you never really heard much about Western Europe, which backed him, and Italy with Mussolini, I guess. And I correct me if I'm wrong. Of course, Japan, I think, was on their side as well, right? So were they resisting at that time? Were they woke or awakened to the fact that this power grid was handled, this New World Order that was being constructed was a Zionist-controlled Rothschild central bank kind of thing? And was Japan aware of that in particular? Because I never really hear about Japan's motives of being aligned with these European countries.
Right. Well, I'm not going to get into a long thing about the Second World War, but I would stress, again, the more we understand about history, the more we try to understand about history, the more one realizes there's not just one side. Sure. There's not some crazy evil person on one side and then good guys on the other. But that's the central narrative of the Second World War, because especially as part and parcel of the whole sort of Holocaust narrative that we hear in our society. But I'll just make this point, just this brief point about the Second World War. Remember, during the Second World War, America's most important military ally was the Soviet Union. Now, by all standards, by any reasonable standard, the most oppressive or tyrannical regime in the world at that time was Stalinist Russia, was the Soviet Union.
That should tell us
that
something.
Was America's so-called good ally. In fact, its most important military ally in the Second World War. Wow. Stalin was praised and honored in the American media from 1941 up until 1945-46 as a good guy because he was on our side. America's second most important military ally in the Second World War was Britain and its empire. And there was no country, no regime in the world more imperialistic at that time than Britain. Britain held hundreds of millions of people in as colonists, as hegemony or dominion over them against their will, making it the most imperial power in the world at that time. But they were are on our side, or we were on their side, however you want to put it, so they're part of the good guys.
That should tell us something, right, Mr. Weber?
The point is that it's not a simple division between so-called good guys and bad guys. If the Axis had won the Second World War, you could be sure they would have museums all around about communism and how terrible it is, and they would remind everybody that the United States was supporting this tyrannical regime. They were good buddies with it.
Hey, Mr. Weber.
That's not what we hear now. Now you'll hear American politicians even try in an odd way to take credit somehow for being against communism or against Stalin when the time was when the Soviet Union was the closest of being overthrown, that is by Germany and its allies.
Hey, Mr. Weber, hold that point. We're coming to a break. Ladies and gentlemen, listen to Battle of New Orleans Radio. Check Mr. Weber's work out at Institute for Historical Review.
We got one more segment with you, Mr. Weber. We'll be right back.
No, we got more than that.
Well, we got two more segments. Thank you.
Got that in.
All right, we are back, Battle of New Orleans Radio. Sorry about that, Mr. Weber. We actually have you to the end of the show, 9 o'clock Central Time. Again, Nathan, we were talking during the break again. The persecution levels. If you ask these questions, it's frustrating for us because we're curious, like anyone else, and a lot of our listeners are curious to know the answers to these questions. Go ahead, Nathan. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, we got a couple calls here in a minute that really have some questions for you, but I kind of want to switch gears because I know we only have a limited amount of time. I'd like to really just get your point on some of these other topics. And, I've watched, a lot of your stuff and listened to, some of your talks. And let's kind of fast forward a little bit to Ronald Reagan, Mr. Weber. And because I know this is way off topic where we've been talking to, a lot of, good American people, they just look at Ronald Reagan and, just as this conservative icon. And, he's really wasn't any different from any of the presidents you see now. There's a lot of control going on. I believe he had 200 Council on Foreign Relations member in his cabinet. So really we're blinded, you know what I'm saying, by a lot of the stuff, we're painted. I mean, there was a lot of horrible stuff that happened under the Reagan administration. You look at the National Vaccine Injury Court was set up. I mean, Iran-Contra is just a couple to start. So, go ahead, Mr. Weber. What's your take on that subject?
Some time ago, I did a podcast about Ronald Reagan and his legacy. And
I think I watched it.
It's astonishing because many people who consider themselves, if you ask American conservatives or Republicans, well, they don't like George W. Bush very much. They don't certainly like the leadership of the Republican Party in the House and Senate these days. But you ask them who they do like, they often say Ronald Reagan. But if you look at the policies of Ronald Reagan, his policies were such that if he was running for president today, or a person was running for president on his outlook and policies, he would be rejected by most conservatives.
Yep.
He supported an amnesty of 3 million illegal aliens. Now, today that's considered, Republicans and conservatives are against that. But that was Ronald Reagan. That was what he actually did and supported as president, and it was consistent with his worldview. His worldview was, well, he wanted America to be a country for everyone. It's also astonishing, too, that conservatives today consider themselves, most of them anyway, they have to be very strong supporters of Israel, and anybody who takes a view similar to Obama or something on Israel, he's really bad. Well, Ronald Reagan, his view about Israel was the same one that Obama or Clinton or Johnson or Nixon all had, that Israel had to, at some point, withdraw from the occupied territories that it seized in 1967. But my point is that today, Republicans standing on that position, taking that position, would be considered, oh, he's an enemy of Israel. We can't support that. Anyway, the point is that, and Ronald Reagan, of course, is these words like conservative and liberal, I think, are largely meaningless. In the last Republican National Convention that nominated Donald Trump as president, he welcomed a speaker who was the first one at a Republican convention to openly proclaim that he's proud to be gay, he's proud to be homosexual. That would have been considered absolutely unacceptable to Republicans or conservatives 10 years ago or even 5 years ago or whatever. in other words, these distinctions, I think, of conservative and liberal have become, I think, pretty meaningless in our society. Donald Trump takes a lot of positions, or has taken a lot of positions, that many people used to be considered liberal. But anyway, my bigger point is that the praising Ronald Reagan like that is largely a last refuge, because Ronald Reagan's great ability was to say things that made people feel good. He was a very good speaker. He gave very soaring talks and did so in a convincing way that I don't think any other politician in recent times has been able to match. And I think the reason for that is that Ronald Reagan grew up during the 1930s and 40s, and he really had this kind of vision of America that he believed, and that nowadays politicians can say the same words as a Ronald Reagan, but they don't really believe it anymore. He believed in an America that's gone, and it's not coming back.
Nope.
And he believed it with a kind of fervor that he was able to communicate to the public and to Americans in a kind of uplifting and way. But his actual policies as president were very unconservative. He increased the federal government. He didn't decrease it, even though he promised to do that. He greatly increased the national debt, which is a huge problem that all politicians, I think, want to just forget even exists. And again, about immigration and other issues, he was very, very different in his policies than at least what he implied he would do before he actually took office.
You know, Mr. Weber, I think we're all guilty of every American, and we can all say, we don't do this, but I believe, we've all been victims of this. We all play identity politics one way or the other, whatever makes us feel good or who we identify with. And, I think we fall victim to this. We all fall victim, to supporting a leader that's our flavor of ice cream. But, really, all of these leaders work for, internationalists that have really taken the country over, especially since, 1913 for sure. And before that. But, it's just a different flavor of tyranny, really, in my point of view.
Well, I often put it this way. I think many people look at politics like they look at sports. They root for a candidate.
Yep.
In the same way that they root for a football team, whether it's collegiate football or professional football or baseball. It's very difficult for many people to get beyond this idea that, well, I'm backing this team. I have said many things, of course, critical of Hillary Clinton, but I've said also things critical of Donald Trump. And sometimes I'll hear people say, well, Mr. Weber, if you don't like Donald Trump, that means you must be for Hillary Clinton. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Not at all. Not at all. And
you have to pick a team, Mr. Weber. That's what they're saying.
Many people look at it like you got to pick a team and you got to stick with it. I don't do that, because this is a dangerous thing, because real politics is about power and about policies that are going to make a difference in the long run.
Hold that thought, Mr. Weber. Coming to a break. That's absolutely right. In my opinion, they all work for this Goldman Sachs gang. That's who they work for. So, Battle of New Orleans Radio. Check out Mr. Mark Weber's work at Institute for Historical Review. We'll be right back.
They took the gold from Gaddafi and the petrol from Hussein, playing God with Assad's democratic regime. All over your Talmud vision, nice as a scene, but that big plasma screen is a crisis machine.
All right, we are back, Battle of New Orleans Radio. Again, we always talk between the breaks, Mr. Weber, and we were talking about the monuments you were talking about earlier in New Orleans. We were really involved in that whole process down here the last year and a half before they took them down, and me and Nathan were talking about how the resistance was so limited that it was really disheartening to see, and that we felt like this was a microcosm of
we were
everything.
Castrated.
Yeah, we were, and the monuments came down. 4 monuments came down the last few months, and we saw this transpiring, and we saw the lack of resistance, that a lot of people were on their keyboards at home being like, somebody needs to do something. But in the end, Mr. Weber, there was no physical resistance. I remember one guy next to us out there at the monuments, we were peacefully protesting to save the monument, said, well, where's all the white-collar people? Where's all the people with the six-figure jobs that I see saying stuff on Facebook and social media? And I said, they're scared to lose their job. They're scared to lose their comfort zone for these things. And here we are, So anyways, I think we have a couple callers that have been holding on for a while.
Let's get Mr. Weber's take real quick on what
Go ahead,
he just
Mr. Weber.
spoke.
What's your take on that?
Well, I would say it's not merely that you don't find people fearing losing their jobs. I think the bigger problem is that people who are conservatives have seen the narrative so changed that they feel there's no point. They've seen so many changes going against what they'd like for so long. They see the tearing down of the monuments as just one more step in a process that's been going on for an awful long time. I think a lot of it is just a sense that, well, wherever you draw the line, conservatives have been retreating and fighting a rearguard action for so long on these kinds of issues that they feel, well, it's just inevitable. What are you going to do? Yeah. And it's also a reflection by many people of just the reality. New Orleans now is a mostly black city. And black people don't look at the Confederate heroes as their people.
Mr. Weber, not to cut you off, but check this out. The black population is on decline. It's always been 70+%, and now it's hovering between 55 to 58%. And the black people in New Orleans could have cared less. It was these other entities, mainly the Walter Isaacson's type, in the Aspen Institute, who was behind Mitchell Andrew, shoving this narrative down everybody's throat, and they got it passed. And if you really look at it, it's really part of this Agenda 21 for culture, the fourth aspect of Agenda 21 about social justice, social equality, and this whole 9 yards of this framework for global government that they started in 1992, the Sustainable Development Plan, and that's really what's going on we see down here. Anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead, sir.
You're right about that. That's true, and it's true that I think most blacks don't have a strong feeling about it one way or the other. But whether you call it the globalist agenda or whatever, this has been in place for so long that most people have just assumed, well, there's very little we can do about it. I think that's a lot of the thing that's going on here. It's not just merely that people are afraid they'll be called names. It's a kind of sense of almost despair on the part of, look, this is reflected in public opinion polls that show that the majority of Americans are very unhappy with the general direction of the country, whether they're white or black or whatever. You find this across the board. In the last election, a majority of the public said they didn't like either of the candidates. Polls show that a majority of people think life is going to be less secure and less prosperous for their children and grandchildren than it's been for them. There's this overall sense across the country that things look gloomy. They don't look good. Yep. And fighting over the monuments in New Orleans is just seen, I think, by a lot of people as part of a general process that's so despairing and so gloomy that fighting on that battlefield just seems almost hopeless.
Yeah, it's definitely a microcosm of everything. Let's take these calls real quick. We have Joseph and Metairie. You've been hanging on forever, man. Sorry about that, brother. Go ahead, Joseph. What's your question for Mr. Weber? All right, Joseph, you there? All right, you hung up. I know you hung on forever. Sorry about that, buddy. We have Dotsie and Metairie. You got a question for Mr. Weber? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's not for Weber. It's you two. You are so valuable in terms of some information, but I listen to you and I get depressed every time I listen to you. You act like we have already lost.
No.
I'm sorry, you gotta tighten up your nuts. No. You gotta act like we're gonna win this. Stop giving in.
We're not giving in. We were at the monuments, and no offense to you. Well, were you at the monuments, ma'am? Were you at the monuments? We were there.
Loser.
Were you out there at the monuments? Wait, hold on. Listen. We're
going to come right back to you, Ms. Dotsie. Hold up.
We want to say something to you. Were you at the monuments with us? We were there. Okay, we're not here to fight with you. We were out there cleaning the monuments.
We appreciate your support.
We were out. Yeah, we appreciate you listening to the show. Look, we turned your mic down for a second. We're going to put you right back on. We just want you. Go ahead.
Anti-Semitic asshole.
Okay, see, now you're cursing us out.
Look, it's not about being anti-Semitic. Miss Dotsie, the problem is...
Wait, hold up. I see people on Facebook right now saying we need to nuke Iran to the sky. Is that anti-Muslim? And you don't question that, do you? Yeah, these are humans too. Okay?
That's right.
That's okay to question Ahmadinejad or question North Korea's leader, but if you question a Jewish leader or some of these Jewish cabals or these international bankers that are basically enslaving you with your fiat currencies, of course, you're an anti-Semite.
And the thing that's what gets me is, look, it's okay to go to the Middle East. We've decimated the Middle East. We have destroyed these countries. We have decimated these Muslims. And most of every of these Christian conservatives across the country will agree with Ted Cruz and will say, turn in the glass. I'm sick of it. These people are people too. The Afghanistan people just wanted to herd their damn goats before we went over there. And we have destroyed this area, Miss Dotsy. And look, to be called anti-Semitic for pointing out what is and what isn't. I mean, come on. We have to get real with the truth and reality of really who's running and ruling us. If we cannot call these people out and we're called names, then we don't stand a damn chance, man.
Okay,
listen. That's not anti-Semitic.
Hey,
it's the truth.
Before Nathan has a conniption in the studio and Mr. Weber's tuning in and listening, the question I have for callers who say that stuff about we need to nuke them to the sky. That's going to solve all of America's
problems. Christian. That's Christian.
That's Christianity. These are the same Christians that go to church on Sundays saying that. And at the same time, if you ask them, are they for the open borders, the Kalargi plan, the relocation of war refugees? Don't they realize that by going into war in the Middle East, going and attacking Iran, Syria, this destabilizes these countries and these refugees come into their countries? And I don't get it. They're for the war, but they're against the refugee being relocated to their neighborhood.
And I want to say one more thing, because I'm fuming over here. Look, people need to understand, there was a Kalargi plan put in place by Count Kalargi in the 20s. He helped create the European Union. Okay, he wanted to flood Europe with African, Middle Eastern, and Asian migrants, create a super race, outbreed the Europeans, shove them out of Europe, and he wanted to put Judaism over the control of this. That is not anti-Semitic. That is anti-Christian. That is anti-white. These international Jews despise white European Christians. That's why we don't have any birth rate. Our birth rate is nothing. We're dying, and we're going to die just to say we're not anti-Semitic. People, wake up, man. I'm sick of it.
Listen, if you are an international Jew, as Nathan says, it is in your best interest to multiculturalize these Christian countries because it ensures that nothing like that can ever happen again. Also, it clears the desert out, like you said, the Kalargi plan. It preserves Israel more so because, those countries around Israel now are destabilized forever. And so Israel's going to be sitting nice. Tel Aviv's beach will be beautiful.
They're putting Tel Aviv's all over the TV right now.
I mean,
go ahead, Mr. Weber, on anything we said. Man, I apologize for getting fired up. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm glad to see there's some spirit, but I don't understand this woman's point. First of all, she seemed to say, well, what I'm saying or what we're saying sounds pessimistic. Is that part of her point?
I don't know. We had to hang up on her. She was getting a little vulgar.
She's rude. She's rude, and a lot of people get rude. I mean, America's problems are most of all internal. We're not going to make America better by turning Saudi Arabia or some other country into a parking lot. In fact, I don't even understand what U.S. policy is. The first country that Donald Trump goes to pal around with in a foreign country is Saudi Arabia, for heaven's sakes. That's about as Arab or as
listen, Mr. Weber,
a country you can get. I mean, we have this bizarre situation in America where our biggest allies in the Middle East are Israel and Saudi Arabia, which are very weird countries in the region. They're not typical, actually.
Star on the sword.
But what gets me is that people that talk about bombing, they talk about Israel. Israel oppresses people regardless of whether they're Christian or not. There's a minority of Christians in Palestine. There's a minority of Christians in the Middle East. They're being treated the same way as the Muslims. But when you bomb people and kill them, a lot of people get angry. They want to fight back. But it's pretty normal. It's pretty understandable. They're angry. They're furious. And the more we bomb, the more angry people that we
radicalize. You're right. All right, we had a little technical difficulty there.
We're going to go right back to Mr. Weber.
And look, we're going to go to the phone lines here. We're going to
we're going to a break right now. Battling New Orleans, right? We're coming right to you, Flaming Liberal. When we come back, then you feel the Patriot. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we're back. The whole live broadcast shut down. The Skype just completely shut down. Soon as all that happened, the whole system shut down. So the only thing you're going to be able to catch us on is the podcast and the YouTube channel. Sorry about that, Mr. Weber. We don't know what happened. Just like the emails you sent me earlier, showed up on my phone, then they disappeared. They vanished. Can't find them anymore. And I don't know. We've been having weird stuff happen all around the city to us.
It's a Gentile horror movie. Really, that's what we're living in.
Goyim's had video cameras come to his house.
Goyim know.
We've had communist producers show up at Professor Marksberry's house and talk about us. So I mean, look, there's just all kind of crazy stuff happening. So anyway, let's go to the phone calls. Oh man, we have who's been hanging along. Let's go to look. You got a minute, Joseph. I'm sorry, Joseph from Metairie. Then we're going to you, Flaming Liberal. Go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah, Joseph, go ahead, man. We got to make it quick, man. This whole show's went crazy. Go ahead, Joseph.
1 minute, buddy. 1 minute.
Okay, you need to get the feds to come down here and investigate this whole mass failure of pumping.
Now, I think it was deliberate. I don't think it was mass failure.
This was intentional. This was intentional there, Joseph.
Because I think what's really going on is a big conspiratorial land grab to drive certain peoples out of certain neighborhoods, and that smells of racketeering.
Well, this is Hegelian dialectic, classic Hegelian dialectic, Joseph, and we appreciate the call.
You got to have a call from. We get Mr. Mark Weber is very valuable. His time's valuable. So you really need to have a question for him.
Let's go to the next one for
Flaming Liberal.
Yeah, you're on the air with Mr. Mark Weber.
Are y'all broadcasting right now?
Yes, we are.
It's going to have to be podcast.
It's
We're
a
not
podcast at WGSO.com's website and the YouTube page.
All the system, the live air on system shut down. Go ahead
and ask your question, Mr. Weber.
But I have to set up the premise. You know, wars have been fought for many, many years. Many times wars are fought over territory and resources.
Every time.
Hitler wanted more land, so he went to war to take that land.
What about the Soviet Union? They wanted land, too.
I'm sorry?
Soviet Union wanted land. They grabbed the land.
But I don't have much time. Let me make my point.
Go ahead. You're right.
And, you know, very often in war, terrible things happen. Like the United States firebombed Dresden in World War II. In one night, I think 100,000 civilians were incinerated. But that was done to shorten the war and demoralize German people to save American lives. As horrible as that was, there was a purpose for it. But can somebody tell me what was the purpose? And this is why we have to honor the Holocaust for the horrible act of hate it was. When little infant babies were tossed into furnaces because they couldn't fight back, and they were killed and burned alive because they were of a Jewish descent and background.
Okay, we got to go. Look, Flaming Liberal, we don't have much time. Let Mr. Weber let Mr. Weber respond. Go ahead, Mr. Weber, respond to that because we're running out of time.
Obviously, we all agree that innocent people being killed is not a good thing. We should all of us, honor, memorialize the death and suffering of innocent people in wars and genocide and so forth throughout history, whether it's Jews or Germans or
Croatian, maybe, sometimes
Chinese,
Croatian,
whatever it happens to be. That's the point. But my bigger point is, what lessons do we draw, and why do we have such a heavy focus on the fate of one particular people? Look, the world is filled, and history is filled with all sorts of very terrible things that have happened to many different people. But what the emphasis in our society on this one particular chapter, as I said, represents the power, the interest, the agenda, the outlook of the people who push for that narrative. That's the whole point. No, I'm not saying nobody should not memorialize or remember Jews who died during the Second World War, or any other people for that matter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we should memorialize everybody. My perspective is, you know, we shouldn't get involved with a lot of these wars. We need to be nationalistic and not get involved in international battles and wars. Anyway, let's go. One last phone call. Flaming Liberal, you got about 1 minute. Hurry up, brother. I mean, not Flaming Liberal. Phil the Patriot. Sorry about that. Go ahead,
quick,
brother.
30 seconds,
1 minute.
Phil. 30 seconds.
Hey, good evening, brother, sister, Christian American patriotic hostages. If you think that the flooding that happened last Saturday was an accident, then you're a fool. It happened by design. They're coming for you, George Soros and Walter Isaacson. So wake up!
Great job, Phil. Tell that to Jeff tomorrow. Thank you very much. Look, we got about 1 minute left with Mr. Weber. 1.5 minutes. Any final thoughts you want to say? Anything you want to plug? Websites?
I want to take up and second on this point you made about having a foreign policy that puts American interests first. And in that regard, remember the wise words of our founding fathers, who emphasized America should stay out of entangling alliances with other countries. George Washington warned against having a passionate attachment to foreign countries. America shouldn't have permanent friends or enemies. We should try to have good relations with as many countries as possible. And that is what the Founding Fathers, whether they were Federalist or Anti-Federalist, whatever their point of view, took. And that was wise advice that our leaders in recent years have failed to heed, with the result that we find ourselves now in these wars, these seemingly endless wars, over and over around the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mr. Weber. And look, we really appreciate your time, and we look forward to, hopefully having you back on soon. Maybe we can get into some other areas, because, I mean, it just, with the commercials, it just, man, the show goes real quick, man. I really appreciate all your information. And look, go check out Mr. Weber's work at the Institute for Historical Review. And thank you, Mr. Weber.
Thank you for coming on our show. Yeah. Great show. Loved it. We'll have you on again.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. God bless. And we appreciate your Louisiana ties, man. If you ever come down here, hit us up.
We'll go to Thibodeau.
Yeah, we'll go eat some good Louisiana cuisine.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, brother. God bless. Look, Battle New Orleans Radio. Been a great show. It's been crazy. This is only for the podcast now because they shut us down. Battle New Orleans Radio.
Oh, no, shut it down.